All right. Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP of Alumni Relations here at Lehigh, and I'm really happy and a little bit scared to bring you this great mountain talk a few days before Halloween. We are doing this webinar with Professor Beth Dolan. Beth got her undergrad at Davidson College and her graduate degree at UNC. She's been at Lehigh for about 18 years. And she is the creator of the project Frankenreads, which we'll hear all about as we discuss, as we get into the book and the class that she teaches. A little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get right into it. Our format today is that Beth is going to give us 5 to 10 minutes overview of what she does in the class in the Frankenreads project, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. And that's the really exciting part of these webinars, is the interactivity. So I do urge you to chat and to ask some questions. The way you do that is at the very bottom of your screen, there's a little, looks like a cartoon bubble that says chat. Just click on that and a window will pop up where you can type in your chat questions. I would suggest that in the to form there, you have all panelists and attendees so that everyone on the webinar can see your questions. And I will read them to Beth as we go along the webinar. So I hope you enjoy this. And the popularity is undeniable. We had 50 people sign up and we just started advertising this yesterday. So a great testament to Beth and the topic. So let's get right to it. Beth.
Hi, thanks so much for joining in on the webinar. I'm excited to talk to you guys about Frankenstein and about a couple projects related to Frankenstein. So this semester, we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's amazing novel. And one thing we might talk about is why this novel is so interesting still to people after 200 years. I'm teaching a class that's cross-listed with English and Health, Medicine, and Society this semester. And that class is called the Lives of Frankenstein. And we are looking at the history of science aspects of the novel, and then also bioethical relevance for today and also in the past of the novel. The class has 25 students. They are a wide mix of majors. From biosciences, psychology, chemical engineering, computer engineering, English, religion studies. It's just all over the place in a really exciting way. And so especially when we talk about history of science, that classroom becomes this kind of lab where I'm definitely a learner along with them, which is really exciting, because they have a lot to teach me about things like artificial intelligence, or virology, so that's really fun for me. Anyway, in the class, we're reading through Frankenstein really slowly. It's the most kind of measured pace I've ever taken teaching the novel, and I've taught it a lot of times. And the reason is I really wanted to dig in deep to the novel to celebrate the anniversary. So every Monday, we read about 3 chapters of the novel, and every Wednesday, we read some kind of history of science, history of medicine, or bioethics material to give that more depth. So I can talk later. I'm happy to talk about some of the discoveries that students have made in that class, things that have really changed my way of thinking about the novel. Just they're a brilliant group, and it's amazing to hear their perspectives on Mary Shelley's text. So in addition to that, in addition to reading the novel really carefully, we're also reading a second novel of Mary Shelley's called The Last Man, which is about the plague. Not the plague, not the early plague, but a plague that takes place in the 18th century that she talks about. Anyway, that class, part of what they're doing this semester is helping host a public-facing event in the Bethlehem area that's linked to an international celebration of this anniversary of Mary Shelley's novel. So let me talk a little bit about the international celebration, where that came from, and what that looks like right now. And if you happen to want to be doing multitasking, you can listen and you can get on your computer and just look up frankenreads.org, which is the website for the international event. It's pretty cool. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about how my class is involved in it. So Frankenreads has started as this little idea. I was a member of the board of directors of the Shelley Association of America. And we had this meeting a couple of years ago, just sort of saying, hey, you know, a lot of anniversaries are coming up around our writers, our Romantic era writers, because they were, you know, early 19th century, late 18th century. What can we do to really celebrate them and get the public interested, get scholars kind of really re-energized about these folks? And so I said, well, why don't we do an all-day reading of Mary Shelley's novel? You know, kind of like Bloomsday, which is this day where people read Ulysses by James Joyce out loud. So it's basically a copy of that, right? And so I threw out that idea, and the president of the Keats Shelley Association really has taken that to levels I wouldn't have imagined. So it's a little bit like, I don't know what, just a germ of an idea that someone else really planted, and it became this huge thing. So it's quite amazing to me. So to give you the details, on Halloween this year, or in the week leading up to Halloween, almost more than 500 institutions around the world in 49 countries is, I think, the latest count now. And you'll see that if you happen to have pulled up Frankenreads.org. There's actually a map that shows where these events are happening all over the world, you know, from Bhutan to Baghdad to Bethlehem. In Bethlehem, we have a number of events that are leading up to that big day. Probably the most high-profile event of the day internationally will be a reading broadcast from the steps or from the Library of Congress. I don't think it'll be on the steps because it'll be November, but I mean, it'll be October 31st, but we'll see. And so there's also a real digital component to all this. So everybody will be tweeting to hashtag Frankenreads. If you're interested, you can follow that. We, of course, will also say at Lehigh University and at the Bethlehem Area Public Library. So we kind of get those groups who are helping sponsor this involved. So people are taking turns reading. So it's community readings, 10-minute segments. Everybody will read. It's about 3 pages of the novel. It turns out to be about 62 readers and about 8 hours of reading if you're doing the whole novel, which we are doing that here in Bethlehem at the Bethlehem Area Public Library. And we created a Google Doc so that the community could sign up and Lehigh folks could sign up. And it went so fast that right now we're scrambling to find places for the Lehigh people to read because, you know, I said, well, let's let the community sign up first. The mayor is kicking it off. We didn't ask him, he volunteered. It's incredible. So the mayor's, the Bethlehem Area School District superintendent is reading. A reporter for the Morning Call is reading. It just, you know, it just spread really fast. And this is something, there's something almost in the chemistry of Frankenstein that creates this movement out and this interest among people, which is something to talk about as well. So my class is involved in hosting this event. They're hosting by creating one group, they're in groups, and one group is creating a slideshow that will go behind the readers. So they've decided to do it by volume. This is a 3-volume novel. The novel moves all over the place, from Geneva to England to Scotland to the Arctic, of course, which is really an important piece. And so there's a lot of scenery that'll be really interesting to have behind it. And of course, there's a lot of pop culture elements, which are really interesting and people hook into. So one group is doing that, another is providing the food and decorating, and they're getting really creative with that. We're all dressing up, or as many of them as I can convince. The public is meant to dress up as well if they want to. Another group is working on audience turnout, so that's kind of a good experience for them to figure out how you get people interested, how you collaborate among groups on campus to make people show up. And then another group is in charge of sort of the readers and getting them their readings and that sort of organizational stuff. I'm also teaching a grad class at the same time that has some Frankenstein elements, and those guys are serving as the sort of commentators at some other events we're having. So we're also doing a book talk at the public library. That's what they call it. It's actually sort of like a book club where people are coming to 3 different meetings, one on each volume of the text. And we had our first meeting on Monday. We had a good turnout, really diverse crowd, people with different interests. So, there's one man there who is an engineer, who has some very interesting things to say about the novel, for example. And there's some people there who I don't think have had the opportunity to have an education, a higher education, who are there and still interested to engage, which is really, really cool. So my grad students too, at each book talk, are doing the sort of facilitating. And then we also have a film series. So you go big or go home with Frankenstein. So we're doing a film series. We had our first film last night. We screened the 1831 Frankenstein with Boris Karloff at Steel Stacks, and it was co-hosted by ArtsQuest and HMS. And we sold out. There are 190 people there. We screened the film and then again talked with the audience about it for about 45 minutes. Yeah, so that's just an overview of what's happening.
Nice.
Yeah.
We did have a question come in.
Great.
Doug Burns is wondering if it's still possible for schools which haven't already joined to do so.
Absolutely. All you have to do is submit your location online, and you'll see that you can, and really don't even have to do that to do it, but it's helpful, you know, to get publicity. There's a toolbox there with resources where we have already created for you posters, flyers. There's a cool graphic that you can just use, you know, free of charge, just for everybody to use and that sort of stuff. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So folks on the webinar, again, the success of these is dependent on your questions. So type here in the chat box your questions and comments for Beth, and I will read them. And while you are, oh, Doug says, thank you. I'm sure my 10th graders will be thrilled.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So nice. Doug, where are you? Let's see if we can respond quickly. While we wait for that, and while we wait for the rest of you to put in your questions, I had a question as I was thinking about this webinar preparing. So Frankenstein is interesting. Obviously, it's been around for 200 years. It's still very popular, and a lot of us really like it. But not everybody devotes their entire life to it. So, what was it like the moment that you decided, okay, this is my thing?
Yeah.
And why? Why is it your thing?
Yeah. Well, let's see. So it really happened my first year at Lehigh, I think, is when I really, I always enjoyed Mary Shelley and her life story, which is fascinating. But I was writing a book about suffering in women's literature of the Romantic era. And I wanted to think about suffering in terms of Frankenstein, because although there aren't, you know, sort of the three main characters are male, etc., there is quite a lot of suffering going on in this novel. There's a lot of death. And I was interested in how Mary Shelley was presenting that, the ways in which she talked about expressing suffering and finding new ways of expressing suffering. So obviously the focus, my original focus was on the creature, who is clearly suffering and is very eloquent and convincing when Victor can't see him. But as soon as anyone sees him, they can't hear him anymore. And I think that's relevant for all kinds of social groups, and has been forever, that you just hear people differently when you see them, right? So that was my first interest. Also, I'm really interested in Mary Shelley because she is the child of two prominent philosophers in the 18th century. And there's a lot of attention on her, especially from her husband, to see what she would do with all this inheritance of intelligence and achievement. And she, in her introduction to the novel, and I think throughout the novel, is really interested in the idea of invisibility and in the idea of seeing but not being seen. So when the creature is in this little hovel outside this house, observing a French family and learning French and reading along with them as they learn, well, he's getting his education there, his invisibility is a very safe place for him. And as soon as he becomes visible, he's in trouble. And I think she's telling us something there about her own life.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned that this class has all kinds of different majors in it,
Yeah.
and it is cross-listed.
It is.
With in English and in health, medicine, and society, which to me speaks to the beauty of Lehigh, the strength of Lehigh, that there are such interdisciplinary in such a unique class. So why do the kids tell you that they are enrolling in this class? Does it make sense to them that it's
I think they're really excited about it. Yeah. You know, I think the bioethics piece is so relevant, and they get that right away. The history of science maybe seems a little more arcane, but you know, the point of really talking about history of science and history of medicine and diving into that, it's a little bit about you know, just kind of general knowledge, which is great to have. It's a little humbling too to realize that we didn't invent everything, and we're not, like the best ever. We may be more technologically advanced, but the kinds of thoughts, the things that people were thinking in the 18th century about how the body worked, were really very interesting and not far from right. In some cases, absolutely right. A large part of the periodic table was discovered in this period, for example, which is amazing. This is when you start having dissection. And real intense anatomy, like they're really starting to understand what's in the body and how those things work. They're just getting a handle on that. So that's fascinating and relevant for this text. Also, this is the period in which electricity, where people are trying to harness electricity. So, Benjamin Franklin famously, has the kite outside, whatever, and the late 18th century. But following Benjamin Franklin, there are a lot of people who are trying to figure out the difference between atmospheric electricity, something they call animal electricity, which they posit is what makes us alive. It's the difference between a dead body and a living one. Anyway, so students are interested in that stuff once you start to really get into it and see where it goes. So that's going to electrochemistry, for example, things like that. And the bioethics questions are amazing. In the class, the first most obvious one is who's responsible, right? Who's responsible for what goes wrong in this novel? So Victor creates the creature, but Victor has an education and he has a childhood. So are the parents anyway responsible for what happens? Are his university professors responsible? Is he responsible alone? Is the creature responsible for killing people? Is there some sort of shared responsibility? Is there a social responsibility from all these people who are rejecting this creature because he's ugly? So that's something that we talk about, and I don't think there's a simple answer to that. And one thing that we get at is how many models there are in bioethics for taking up a question like that. So you might have something like, thinking about virtue ethics, which is basically saying that if Victor is a bad person, anything he creates is bad, just to oversimplify it. Or you might go to something like consequentialist ethics, which is if the outcome is bad, then the act is bad. You know what I mean? And again, I'm using bad in this very broad way, but it's not ethical. And then a sort of another model which I find appealing because of narrative is narrative ethics, which says that instead of having these a priori systems like principle-based ethics, which is also super useful, that's where we get the definition of autonomy, for example, very important. But instead of using something like that where you're bringing in a system, you listen to all the stories for the stakeholders. So you can imagine this happening maybe for a bioethics committee in a hospital. Everybody who is a stakeholder, shares their story and their sort of perspective on what's happening. And then the decision making happens based on considering the moment and the circumstances and sort of maybe degrees of harm and how to manage that. That's not necessarily tied to any kind of pre-existing list of principles or something. Anyway, so all this gets really exciting. I go on and on, obviously.
I have to say it's a little disappointing that in so many years, brilliantly high students have not found the answer.
Right? I know, right? Well, I do think that there is a front runner in answers. Yeah. I mean, I think the front runner really has to do with society, with the social definitions of beauty. Is it, that's a problem for the creature. That the society, I mean, I think Mary Shelley's really careful about this. So it's not just Victor who rejects the creature. He does originally, for sure, and that's a problem. It's bad parenting. That's something we talk about. If you're going to have a baby, maybe raise that baby and do a good job. You know what I mean? That's sort of where we end up. Right, or find someone to raise that baby. Right. You know what I mean? But whatever. So somebody to take care of this life. So there's that.
So you get to sum up the answer.
We do, yeah.
We have a question from Jim Mulholland. He says, ever thought of giving Bram Stoker equal time, the author of Dracula?
Yeah.
In a couple of years, it will be the 125th anniversry of that novel.
There you go. I like that.
So you have another 20 years of classes.
I can plan that. Yeah. That's a great idea. I mean, it just takes some people who are excited about it to make something like this happen, and then it spreads. My sense from community events is that people want to have spaces where they can come together and talk about something besides politics. for example, or besides, you know, the new parking plan wherever they are. Yeah.
So for those of you who haven't been back to Lehigh, they're introducing a new parking plan, and
yeah. It's epic.
Yeah. But that's interesting. Does politics creep into these things, or do people really just want to get
They
into
do.
the
Of course it does.
Yeah.
I've been really interested in that just in our 2 public events, because people will allude to things, but I think they're a little afraid to dive all the way in. And definitely the graduate students running these events it makes them nervous, because you can, I mean, last night at the film, here's an example. Someone said, in the audience said, well, Victor creates alone, and the outcome of that is terrible. And that is definitely one of Mary Shelley's points, is that Victor should have been having, you know, his bioethics committee or whatever, colleagues, someone to sort of help him think through consequences.
Right.
But instead he's all alone, and he sort of loses it. And this guy connected that to solitary confinement in prisons and sort of the way in general our prison system works, which was really an interesting place to go. And then another woman immediately raised her hand and said, well, I don't care what you say, some of those people deserve to be in jail, and the death penalty is important. And I was like, whoa, how do we get there? Right. And so for the grad students, they kind of just let that pass and took another question. I think it could have been interesting, and I understand why they didn't, but it could have been interesting to go back to the first guy and talk a little bit more about other options, because his point was really great. It's sort of about, you know, how do you expect someone to reform if you're not socializing, if you're not giving them a stake in society?
Yeah.
So
very interesting. But maybe that's, you know, one of the questions is, there are lots of books that were written 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And the enduring nature of this book, maybe because it does spark ideas about politics or about ethics or all these, do you think that's why it's lasted this long? I
do. So my student's first paper was on the Franken prefix. So they had to sort of do a survey of literature on PubMed, and also just America's newspapers, like just various databases of material, to find out how that word is being used. And it's, you know, so the most common example is probably Frankenfoods, which is a term for GMOs, right? So there's like a pop culture version of the novel which says overreaching in science is bad, and especially where you're changing nature and the way things were. That definitely comes out of the film tradition more than the novel, but of course it starts with the novel. And I think the idea is that anything that is a human-made intervention in the natural world that has the potential to get out of control, that's the key. You know, so before these sort of major advances in technology and science that we've had in the 20th century, you know, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, this idea of Frankenstein was used to represent kind of mob rule or political movements out of hand. So it was the same idea, but just not sciencey. So for example, there's a famous cartoon that shows Charles Parnell as this like little hunched over guy who's supposed to be the creator of the nationalist movement in Ireland. And the nationalist movement is this big creature, you know, who's gone beyond his control.
Interesting. So one of the things today, obviously, is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So the engineers must bring a really interesting perspective to your class on that. Can you talk a little bit about the AI and what the conversations are
Definitely.
now?
I mean, that's been fascinating. And again, that was something that a student brought up in class first, but at the book talk event, that was also a sort of hot topic of discussion. So I think everybody's okay with a computer. They seem to be, you know, they serve us, to put it just really bluntly, they do. But it's when you have AI, and especially AI that can sort of learn and then eventually kind of make decisions on its own. So self-driving cars is a good example. And people like to point to that as a massive failure because there's something not human about them. They can't make human decisions. Not that we don't mess up all the time, right? But that's really unnerving, I think. And the idea that, you know, somehow this artificial intelligence could get beyond our control, that it'll be more powerful than us. I call them they, which is weird. That those creatures or whatever will be more powerful. In Mary Shelley's novel, the creature is more powerful. He's extremely eloquent. He's very agile. He's big. He's strong. He can withstand heat and cold. You know, so it's kind of that. What happens to humans when this better creature takes over?
Interesting. Well, just recently when you're in Gmail, the words start to appear now, and I've seen some conversations about that it's not, it's here, it's not, and it's not life-threatening, but boy, it could be embarrassing. Or the thing on the autocorrect. There's whole tweets storms about that.
Absolutely. You know, and I think one of the most brilliant comments that someone made at the book talk, a member of the community, was that we have already invited machines into our lives, and not just our lives, but really our bodies. Like we know now that using the phone to the degree that we use it, and using screens, changes how we think, right? Googling everything you want to remember changes how we think. And there's a way in which you could think of our devices that we have closest at hand, like iPads or smartphones, as extensions of us. We're sort of roboticizing ourselves. Like, that's a different way to think about it. Instead of, oh no, this computer, whatever, this artificial intelligence could be taking the places of humans, we're already turning ourselves into sort of these machine companions.
Yeah, there's a whole discussion in the Olympics committee.
Really?
Of at what point, they've got the Paralympics.
Oh, right.
And so what makes, and then other people are having hip replacements. If I went into the Olympics with a hip replacement, does that give me an advantage? Because now I'm part robotic. And there's all this. Yeah,
what is human? Right. And you could go back to Donna Haraway's, sort of more theoretical writings about the cyborg, right? And she says, we are already cyborgs. If we alter our bodies, we're cyborgs. So getting your ears pierced would be the most mundane example of that. We've done something to change what's natural.
Right. Contact lenses.
So it's not this scary other. We're already there. And now we just have to decide, what are we going to do with it,
Yeah. So if you could talk to Mary Shelley now, what do you think? What do you think she would say or do? Would she be completely surprised that 200 years later she's being taught at Lehigh University?
I don't know if she would. So the first production, the first kind of spin-off of this novel happened in her lifetime. It was the novel was first published in 1818. By 1823, somebody had a play in the West End called Presumption, and she went to it, and she was really pleased with it. And it was very different. It took a different spin on things. It made the creature more monstrous than he is in her book, etc. And she thought it was cool. Wow. So I think she'd be delighted. I don't think she'd want to do press interviews. No. I don't think she was someone who liked the public eye. Yeah.
So she would not be the one reading at Library of Congress.
Then. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know.
Do you ever get into in your class, one of the things that strikes me is that this was a young girl, 200. I mean, it's hard for women to get published now.
Right, yeah.
So to have this young girl become published and so famous.
Right.
Do you think she went through any of the same kind of stuff that a lot of female authors and actresses and things go through now? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's one of the reasons it's so much fun to teach it to college-age students, because they are traditional, college-age students. Because she was 19 when she wrote the genesis of the novel, and she was living a very unconventional lifestyle, and it became this huge hit. It's more famous than anything Percy Shelley ever thought about doing, and he certainly positioned himself as he was more educated, because he was male. So she was educated at home by her father, which is not nothing because he was a super famous philosopher. But yeah, in terms of what she went through, so she published the novel anonymously at first, and people attributed it to either Lord Byron or Percy Shelley. So there was definitely a feeling that there's no way a woman could have created this. And then her novels that she published afterward, she published under the byline of by the author of Frankenstein. And by then people pretty much knew it was Mary Shelley, but she wasn't allowed to use the Shelley name because of her father-in-law, who said that he was an aristocrat. He said he wouldn't leave his money to her son if she used that name ever, because her husband, according to him, had ruined the name because he was an outspoken atheist and he was a married man who ran away with a young girl, etc. Right. So yeah, he created some problems. Drama.
So much drama. Yeah, I mean the story of of that group is as compelling as a novel.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, it is exactly 3 o'clock, and we like to stick to time because we know you all are busy and you have Frankenreads to sign up for and things to do. So thank you, and we have a couple of thank yous here that people have written on the screen as well.
Thank you for listening.
Yes, yes, I look forward to next week.